By the power invested in me, I now pronounce you Mr. and Mrs. Thick! Everyone, just letting you know that all figures found in this review could be found over at BigBadToyStore.com. Links could be found in the description below, and if you guys use them, they help out the channel quite a bit. We are gathered here today to review two sought-after figures because often a lot of people don't really like when figures get bundled together and spikes up the price, especially in the current climate that Hasbro Marvel Legends finds themselves in. But everyone kept talking about this particular Spidey and how badass of a figure he truly is that happens to come in this pack celebrating the Renew Your Vows storyline from the Marvel Comics of Spider-Man. And I'm not going to go into the nitty-gritty details about how it takes place after Secret Wars and all that stuff, but basically what you need to know is that Renew Your Vows is pretty much an alternate storyline where Peter and Mary Jane really did make it out of it alive, but beyond that they had their own happy ending, got married, and even had a daughter. But aside from that, we also needed to take into the little wincy detail that Mary Jane became Spinneret, and therefore Marvel Legends, to commemorate the 60th anniversary, took upon themselves to take that plot and materialize it in the form of these two action figures. And it is another 2-pack, so we really don't want to waste too much time because we got a lot of ground to cover here since they decided to really, kind of up the ante a little bit amongst the value here, especially when it comes to the Spidey, which we're going to tackle first head on here, because this guy has been making the rounds on Reddit, on Twitter, saying that this is probably one of the best molds and interpretations of Spidey, period, that you need to look out for. If you're in the market for a very classic looking Spidey with great posability and great sculpt all around, this is pretty much the Spidey to go for. It's just depending on who you ask, a bit of a downer that he has to be bundled in with a 2-pack, and that kind of escalates the price. So that could be a make or break for some folks. For me, I thought to myself, okay, it's a bit of a bonus. It's just a hit that you have to take to the wallet. But upon playing with the Spidey here a little bit, I noticed two things. One, they took one of the better molds that I'm genuinely a fan of, and that is going to be the Black Symbiote, at least the most recent retro card, Black Symbiote Spidey mold. Especially when I looked on the torso here and took upon the articulation and the different joints that separate, I distinctly noticed this is that particular mold. And if you guys go back and watch that review, you'll notice that I actually ended up falling in love quite a bit into this mold. I actually really dig the way that this is sculpted, the way that the scale looks proportionate, everything about it I genuinely enjoyed. And because of that, pretty much putting a classic skin of Spidey onto that mold is a marriage made in heaven. All right, no pun intended here, but basically this was a very smart move on Marvel Legends' part, as opposed to using like the 2099 sculpt or any of the other ones that I feel a little bit too janky or stilted. This is actually one of the finer looking ones because he's got the right amount of bulk and musculature while at the same time not looking overly brawny or overly skinny. He's a very happy medium, and overall I'm genuinely satisfied with the way that Hasbro Legends was able to articulate, no pun intended again, but they were able to illustrate a very fine looking Spidey, reminiscent of not just that particular comic book arc, but also just pretty much fill the hole in my collection of a classic looking Spidey. Albeit I'm a little indifferent to the open lenses on the head sculpt, but at least the paint utilized for that sculpt, as well as the rest of the chest, the symbol on the front, as well as the one on the back, even though it gets a little warped because of the way that they articulated the joints with the butterfly joints here. It looks a little wonky when you extend them, but we'll get to that later on. The articulation, the actual paint and the stenciling and design is just really good. It's classic, it's simple, but it gets the job done, and because of that, he leaves an impression on me. And much like that symbiote suit Spidey, the articulation is no different. The head is able to rotate fully 360, as well as allow the hinge inside to move upwards and downwards. Slightly, I wish it was a little bit better, especially going down because of how stiff and sticky it kind of is, and when you kind of move it up, you risk of either popping the head off, especially because of the accessories being kept in mind, but also you see a little bit of hollowness underneath, but nothing that, like I said, makes or breaks the figures, just a little bit of nitpicking on my part. Then you get to the arms, where you have a joint that allows it to fully move all the way around vertically, as well as properly extend towards the sides, and then you have, of course, the butterfly joint baked inside that allows it to extend from the front to the back, although this time I feel like it's kind of restricted on both of them, not just the the left one, because as I mentioned in reviews past, the left one is often a little bit stiffer than the right one. The right one will flex a little further. This time, both of them are a little bit on the restricted side. I don't know what that was. I don't know if it's because they kind of sculpted it in a way where they're slightly bigger sizes, and because of that, it's kind of going against the plastic on the main torso piece. But either way, you still get a proper amount of extension through that butterfly joint. But like I mentioned before, it does kind of warp and weird out the design of the spider symbol here on the back, so just do take that into consideration. So if you want to keep it as is, you kind of have to line the legs up to the middle part of the symbol right about there. Then you do get a bicep that allows it to fully rotate 360 degrees. 2 joints at the elbow that fully bend, although mines were just a little bit on the stiff side. I had to take some hot air to them to be able to break them in, but they do fully bend there. And then the wrists are, of course, your archetypal hinge joint baked inside that allows it to fully rotate 360 as well as pivot inwards and outwards like so. And much like that symbiote suit Spidey, my favorite part was in fact the torso, because they gave him a really cool, delectable little torso joint right here in the middle that allows it to fully bend 360, but it's semi-ratcheted. You know, it's not fully ratcheted like to make exact clicking noises, but you can kind of feel different pops in place, especially when you put it in a particular way facing forwards or to the sides, and a good amount of crunching, not only towards the front, but also towards the back, extensive towards the back like so, and a little bit from side to side. Then you take into consideration the hinge joint on the waist that allows it to fully bend backwards and forwards via a ratcheted joint that pops into different places, so you get an awful lot of movement going on right there, so very posable. Then you get to the top leg joints that are pretty standard issue. You're able to fully extend them forwards about that far. Not much towards the back because of the way that the butt sculpt is very recognizable of that of the symbiote suit Spidey. It's even got a little bit of that tightness on the costume. You can see the creases there in the middle. Yes, I just pointed that out. You're only reviewer that's probably gonna point that out. Unless I'm missing somebody, but I digress. One little detail I did notice, though, is that in those top leg joints, you can actually shrug, so to speak, the top legs up and downwards within the waist piece. I don't know if this is a specific scenario to mine, or if every Spidey figure from the Renew Your Vows 2-pack comes with this. Please let me know in the comments if you guys own this Spidey figure. Do you guys have it? Or is this just an isolated case? Then we get to some very interesting details that probably makes this, by technical default, one of my favorite Spidey figures in some time as far as articulation is concerned. Because like I mentioned in Amazing Fantasy, I really dug that they were able to throw in both a thigh swivel and a boot cut. Guess what they did with Renew Your Vows Spidey here? They did it again. Thigh swivels on both of the top portions of the legs that are able to fully rotate 360, but you do get a boot cut here towards the bottom where the red and blue separate. That is awesome. Much appreciation, Marvel Legends. You know, ever so often you do some questionable things, but this is fortunately not one of those times, so I appreciate it. In between, you do have 2 more joints that are able to fully bend at the knee. And then we get, of course, to that traditional ankle joint that is able to flex downwards, although mine are just a little bit on the stiff side, and forwards ever so slightly, but they only rotate when they're facing down. No real movement horizontally from side to side, only at kind of at an angle to allow them to slightly pivot. But if you look a little closely, we get toesies. I'm sorry, I know I'm getting hyped over the wrong things here, but we got toesies on a Spider-Man figure. I usually talk about that with McFarlane's, so to have a Marvel Legends, there's probably been some in the past that have done this, but to me, this is actually pretty amazing that this is my first Marvel Legends that I own. I know, possibly a little bit of a sad case, but you got hinge joints here to flex the toesies. That's amazing. Albeit I wish that they would have sculpted them just a little better, because there's something about the way that the hinge inside might have not have been molded properly. And because of that, you'll see right here that the toe not only flexes upwards like it's supposed to, but it flexes down to the point where it looks almost like a beak on his toes. It looks awkward. So, you know, I try my best to just keep it as flat as possible or flex him upwards like it's supposed to, because once you go down like that, it just looks weird. So I wish that they would have tightened that up a little bit, but just the fact that they threw in the joint period is enough for me. Now this time we didn't get any real web accessories, which part of me is just a little happy considering how tired I was of seeing that exact same piece like I recently mentioned on the Amazing Fantasy review, but they might have just maybe thrown in a little something extra that could be better. By default, he comes with the fisted hands, as you've seen not only here, but in figures past. He'll of course come with the open hands that you're able to swap them in, have the exact same articulation, and as expected, they're meant to be for wall crawling stands or any kind of open hand purposes. And being that he's Spidey, of course, he's gonna come with web shooting hands. It's a little counterintuitive since they didn't throw in any web accessories this time, but it is still Spidey, and I'll still take them. Apart from that, one of the things that I've always wanted not just Marvel Legends to do, but also McFarlane Toys, because I've always preferred this over something that is a little bit redundant or unnecessary, is an extra head sculpt. And they decided to throw in a Peter Parker kind of smirky head sculpt here to be able to swap with the masked version, especially since this is meant to be an interpretation of the Renew Your Vows storyline, and more often than not, there's more panels in that comic book story arc where he's not wearing the mask because he's not really worried about protecting his identity with Mary Jane. They're casually kind of strolling about without their masks, especially when they're at home. So this makes sense. This not only makes sense, but this is actually a very good head sculpt to interpret that version of Peter Parker. Now, if I was to get a little nitpicky, I would say that he is sweating like a motherfucker. I don't know what it is. Maybe it's because he's, trying to internalize the fact that he's married now. But he is very, very glossy. I wish I would have kind of downplayed a little bit on the sheen on his face to give us a much more matted look the way that his hair is. But overall, the paint decals and the actual sculpting at play here is very, very nice. And if I was to take my nitpicking in an extra direction, is to say that maybe I would have liked a second head sculpt of the masked version of the head, only with like squinted or much more narrowed eyes so that we can get a little bit more expressive. But that's just, even at that point, I recognize that I'm asking for a little bit too much. So it's good to see that you got a swappable head here. And also, it's pretty interesting that swapping the heads out is a little tough. They kind of built the ball joint inside a little bigger than I give it credit for, so you kind of have to give them a little bit of a tug, but at least they're going to be firm and still be able to be movable amongst the head sculpt. So it's pretty cool that they threw that in there. So without further ado, let's get our dearly beloved here to complete our review of the Renew Your Vows 2-pack, which is going to be, of course, Spinneret, aka Mary Jane Watson. Before we do get to her, however, if you guys are enjoying this video, let me and the algorithm know by hitting the thumbs up button down below. I would greatly appreciate it. I'll admit, here's where we get just a little bit on the bias side, because obviously Spider-Man's always gonna have the bulky physique and the articulation, and so by default, Mary Jane needs to be built on a much more slender physique. So the plastic needs to be on point to make sure that you're not dealing with a very delicate figure that you're going to be scared to break or tamper with or maneuver. You're not going to be scared to pose and take it off the shelf and put it in a variety of poses. And for the most part, that's kind of true, except for when we get to a little bit of the arms. The way that this overall is built is a little bit varied from place to place, because on the one hand, I really feel like they still kept a level of quality intact with the head sculpting, the hairs in particular, because Mary Jane's, aka Spinneret here, part of her costume is to expose the hair, so you got to make sure that the hair is sculpted properly and painted properly, and I feel like they nailed it. They really did nail it for the red streaks as well as the actual etchings and the strains of the hair along the sides here, as well as the smile she's got going on, as well as the mask. It actually looks very much on point. And then the colors and pastels, so to speak, the actual hue they went with for her costume really is on point as well. I just feel like there's a couple of times here and there where the shading is just a little off. You'll notice that the red on the chest area is a little bit more saturated than that of the areas around her stomach, as well as the, I guess you could call it the underwear piece. You'll notice it's a little bit more muted, so it might have been a little bit weird when mass producing this thing to make sure that the colors were on point. But overall, I really do dig the design for the costume itself, and I think they did a pretty decent job of replicating that here. It's just a little weird that, you know how when they say someone skipped leg day? Someone skipped arm day. because you could see here that they sculpted the legs very, very well, and you got a really good interpretation of her physique from the comics. But when we get to the arms, yeah, it may be comic accurate, but it still doesn't service the figure all too well as I could have hoped, because whenever handling these arms, they're so noodly that it often kind of scares me that I might break something, especially when you take a few of the bending pieces here in the middle with the elbow that just sometimes just feels like I'm stressing the figure in a way where I need to back off. I need to back off and not force it, because I do not want to risk breaking the Spinneret here. It was also Spinneret who unfortunately brought to my attention that there are a couple of cases of splotching with the paint decals, which are not inherently a problem with the design, but rather the mass producing, like I mentioned before. You'll see a little bit of red splotching going on the back of the spider symbol on her back here. And this also brought to my attention, is there any splotching going on with Spider-Man? And there technically is. It was a little easier to miss because of how much more darker his color scheme is, but on his shoulder, you see a couple of little blue streaks. And yes, this does harken back to what people have pointed out about the packaging, that you can't really see these things via the window that is not existent there. And I understand that. I'm kind of coming around on that, so as much as I have kind of like this like-dislike relationship with the packaging, I understand that argument. So let me go ahead and show you what I'm talking about as far as the feebleness of the arms that kind of scares me, because I need to be able to demonstrate that in the articulation. So the head is able to rotate 360. I feel like this time around, as opposed to Spidey, her head joint is actually built a little looser, to where maybe that ball joint was made a little bit on the smaller side. So therefore, moving her around like that is just a little looser than I would have liked it for it to be. And contrary to that is the hinge joint inside that allows it to pivot downwards and upwards is a little bit stiff, so you kind of have to give it an extra bit of a push. Plus, I don't know if it's just me, but is it just me, or her neck just built in a way that's overly long? It just looks kind of awkward to me. Again, a lot of little things that may be faithful to that design from the comics, but that doesn't always translate to figure form. It's kind of like how when people say that something happens in the source material of a book or a comic book or a novel, whatever, and when they try to put it in a movie, it just doesn't work all that well because it just doesn't translate. I feel like we have a similar thing going on here in figure form, and that's why the arms are just so weird. Yes, you do have a joint at the top that allows it to fully flex and rotate vertically 360, and some decent extension to the sides right here via that joint, but no butterfly joint of any kind found here. And then you do have biceps that are able to rotate right there at that midpoint of the bicep swivel as well. Then we get to, again, the most fearsome part of the joints, the elbows. You do have two joints in there, but whenever I try to bend them, it's always just one that bends. And when I try to go a little bit on the extra mile, the bicep is just thick enough, but then the forearm is thin enough to the point where it's almost like they kind of cancel each other out. So when I try to flex kind of the two joints together, I feel like the forearm is bending in a way that I think I might warp it, or even worse, break it. And I can't get that top joint of the elbow to fully move, at least on the left arm. I was able to have some better success with the right arm. So if I kind of show it off over here, you'll notice that I was able to fully bend both, but it's scary because it's almost like I have to anchor the top joint before bending the forearm. So then you do that. You know what I'm saying? Like, some extra work needs to be done there, and it needs to be all one smooth motion. Otherwise, like I said, there's a risk of breaking. One of these days, we're thinking to ourselves, oh, I just want to pose it like this, and we're not really thinking. Maybe it's early in the morning, I don't know, but then it causes some problems. It causes some concerns later on in the future, especially as wear and tear starts to take hold, because after all, these things are plastic. They're going to wear and tear over time. So I kind of wish that a little bit more R&D was put into not just those joints, but the arms overall. The wrists themselves also follow suit. You have the typical joint there that allows it to fully rotate, as well as bend inwards and outwards. And then we get to the torso, which sadly only comes with one joint here in the middle that allows it to fully rotate 360 degrees and also flex very generously towards the back, not so much towards the front. It kind of sticks just right about right there in almost a neutral position, but it fully flexes towards the back in a much more favorable position, especially considering her her physique. Then we get to the legs, where we are able to fully extend towards the front about that far via the top leg joint. Not much because of the way that sculpting is going on back there. Then we get to extension, where sadly we are somewhat limited. I don't know if it has to do with the way of how wide her hips were being made here, but you're only able to extend to about, I want to say, a 45-degree angle. Not much going on right there. You can see right there, we got top thigh joints that are able to swivel all the way across, but unfortunately, unlike Spidey, no boot cuts of any kind to allow more mobility down towards the bottom. You do have two joints at the knee that are able to fully flex all the way upwards like so. And then we get to the ankles that not only have the joints that, like I mentioned before, I don't really like because it's able to pivot upwards and downwards, sure, but you can't really rotate without bending them all the way downwards or pivoting them side to side like so. And the second problem I have is that there's these cuffs that are kind of getting in the way every so often, and the only way to really have a pleasant experience moving these ankles around is simply just take them and shove them up. At least they're not glued, otherwise they would have been in the way and counterintuitive to the joint itself, so at least they were able to be articulated in some fashion. But again, this is just another example of why this time around the design didn't really favor the figure in any kind of way. Except for when we get towards the... Oh my god. Great ass! Not again. We're not doing this again. Oh my god. Yeah, it looks like McFarlane Toys is not the only one that that really appreciates the form of their female characters, as you can see right here. Oh my god. This is probably the only area where I'd say that the faithfulness maybe did play a very huge part in creating this figure, and it is quite something. It is, you know, I don't know what to say. Although I do find it interesting that if we can, you know, for a moment take our gaze away, you know, a little higher up here, you'll notice that she actually comes with 2 slots on her back. Spidey didn't really come with any of that, so it's interesting that Spinneret did come with the slots for any kind of like of those posing bases where you can kind of stick one of those things in there to give her some aerial poses or anything like that. So pretty peculiar. Much like Peter, no web accessories found for Spinneret this time around, but she pretty much has the exact same equivalent of the accessories that Peter did come with. Her own set of hand accessories. She comes by default with the fisted ones, but much like with Spidey, we got open hands, as you can see right there, for those wall crawling poses and abilities. And then 2 web shooting hands as well. Now, frankly though, much like with the arms, I feel like the quality behind the hands also feels just a little bit on the flimsier side. I don't know if it's just me being a prude, but there's just something about the hands that feel a little finicky and kind of, it gives me a little bit of pause to swap them in and out, only because of just how flimsy they kind of feel. But they are there. Now, thankfully, what is not very flimsy is also her secondary head sculpt, which is pretty much like Peter's, an unmasked and much more relaxed looking Mary Jane head sculpt with her hair down. The actual detailing and sculpting and etchings going along her hair is actually much more elaborate than it was before, and because of that, it's actually, in my opinion, probably the preferred head. This one does come with a mask, which goes along with the rest of her outfit, but this one is the one that I feel is just a bit more on the premium side. The painting and the etchings and the design work around her face and the way it just kind of brims a little bit to life, I would say this is probably one of the better head sculpts in this 2-pack, even more so than that of the Peter. In fact, this is honestly the way that I wanted them to do the skin tone, as far as that glossiness that I was kind of complaining about with the Peter head. This is really what I was kind of hoping they would do with Peter, and kind of interesting that they didn't do it. But either way, you can swap out the heads. The head joint inside is a little bit on the looser side, as you can see, so it's a little easier to kind of pop them in and out. So let's go ahead and give them their much more relaxed look. And there we have the happy couple. They actually really do look good together, and now I'm actually starting to really understand why they threw them in the same 2-pack, because now with their relaxed, unmasked looks, I can see exactly why it is that this was meant to be a very ceremonious collaboration or commemoration of not only the Renew Your Vows storyline, but also just Spidey overall. I mean, this is a very integral point in the comics that took the world by surprise to see that Spidey was actually getting a happy ending. Not only that, but his partner was also pretty much going into the superhero business and being an awesome addition at that. Now, in figure form, there are some things to really address here. Yes, the Spidey figure is awesome. The head sculpt they threw in is a very worthwhile effort. But then Spinneret herself has some areas that needed a little bit of extra work because I feel like I mentioned before, not everything that works in the comics from a design standpoint didn't translate well into figure form. Once you throw them in together, then some values are elevated in a way where this is actually a very worthwhile 2-pack if you're able to put down the money. If I was to review each figure individually, I would wholeheartedly say that Spidey is a definitive 9 out of 10. After some time, this is probably one of my favorite Spider-Man figures in my collection thus far. Spinneret, I would say, is a 7 out of 10 considering that the value they threw in with the extra head sculpt, the actual meticulous detail behind the extra head sculpt, and I really do like the design work on her suit. I just think that from an articulation standpoint and a sculpting standpoint, those arms are just one of my biggest pet peeves as a collector for any side, whether it be with Marvel or DC, and there were some detriments found there. As a value, I would say it averages out to a very even 8 out of 10, and if you guys have the money and are willing to fit them into your collection, then these guys are definitely worth going the distance for. I now pronounce this 2-pack reviewed, and if you guys want to bring the happy couple over for the honeymoon, then please do so by checking out the link in the description on over to Big Bad Toy Store. The link does help out the channel, but you guys can also own what is arguably one of the better Spider-Man molds in quite some time, and as a bonus, a Spinneret figure. That way you can complete the Spider-Verse collection. Let me know what you guys think of the 2-pack in the comment section. Is this worth it? Do you think that it's kind of like one of those 2-packs where you're only interested in one half of the figure or both, or do you think that having the two kind of elevates the quality and makes you think, oh, now I understand it? And as always, stay humble, and I'll see you later.